Good morning, family.
Good morning. Good morning.
I want you to know I love you, and I hope that we all love one another as Christ commands. We are indeed a family of God and children of Him. I must make a confession this morning. Over the past several months, as you know, many things have happened which have distracted me from my main job, which is to preach the Word here. And it's come to my attention that some are having trouble understanding because of my teaching style. So just like any good coach, at halftime, when he's down, he makes adjustments, right? So that he can come back and win the game and do well. So I'm going to try to adjust my style as well in the hopes that it'll be easier for everyone to understand and it will help me grow as well. To take care of some business, I'm still looking for help with the website. So if you're at all interested in helping with that ministry, please let me know so that we can improve it. How many of you have been to the new website? A few. I encourage you to go there because we're trying to make it more dynamic, meaning not static. We're trying to put news up there. There's a calendar that's there. Things that way we can communicate with everyone. And I hope you'll take advantage of that and encourage others, your friends, to go there as well. The word disciple is often misunderstood today. It's an antiquated term. Not many people will use the word disciple. They'll use other words in its place. It is usually, though, taken or understood to be a religious term today. But the concept of it will vary from someone who you believe is a member of a cult when they use that word. I'm a disciple of whatever. It could also vary to mean someone who practices some type of religion. When you hear that word disciple, you think of, well, he practices a certain type of religion. So it is associated with religion in most things. Today we're going to look at closely at whether there are differences between, as the slide asks the question, is there a difference between being a believer of Jesus Christ or a convert of Jesus Christ and or being a disciple of Jesus Christ? And I think most of us know there is, and we're going to talk about that today. You know I'm big on context, right? Historical context, because if you don't understand the original context, how can you ever apply it to your setting, your day, your culture? But if you understand how it was originally meant, you'll be able to understand it in your culture, in your time. We're going to be asking 3 questions to help us answer that question. How did Jesus and those around him define the concept of being a disciple? How did they envision what a disciple was? Just as first century teachers in Judea, they all had a specific style and they all had certain expectations or requirements of their disciples, right? Well, Jesus also had some pretty stern commitments and requirements and expectations of his people, as we'll see. And then third, what are the characteristics that separate true disciples of Jesus from those who are simply believers in him. First question, what did it mean to be a disciple of Jesus, David? In first century Judea, of course, that's where Jesus and his disciples were. They were at a time in history where things had changed dramatically from the Second Temple period to the time they went into exile. From that time on, they ceased to have a real temple until Herod rebuilt the second century temple. And then when Alexander the Great conquered Judea, he brought with him Greek things, especially the Greek language. And he encouraged Jews to disperse throughout the known world, right? So Jews would go to, say, Thessaloniki or Corinth to be sailors or shipmen. And they kept their culture to an extent, but they were pretty much Greek in all other aspects. And also in this period, there weren't priests that went around to every town or were assigned. It used to be the Levite priests would be assigned to different towns, and they were there to instruct the people. Well, in this period, rabbis replaced that priest concept. Rabbis were learned men of the law, of the old law, and the customs and traditions of the Jews. So, and they would be in towns spread out throughout Judea, as well as the Greek world. The synagogue became the center, or the activity center for the Jews. They could no longer travel to the temple, many of them, and offer sacrifice. So they went to a temple and they were taught by either a religious leader or a rabbi. And at the synagogue was like a community center and a school. They taught children there. They had fellowship meals. They worshiped there. So they did just about everything there together. Kind of like we do, when we have our fellowships at the building. This, in essence, is our synagogue. So what was a disciple? The definition back then, mathetes is the Greek word. Say that with me. Mathetes. Try it again. Mathetes. No way it said that word. Mathetes was the Greek word for disciple. And what it meant, it was a student or a pupil, an adherent or a follower, or mainly what we would associate it with today is an apprentice. If somebody's in a trade, for instance, they're in a union, carpenter union, let's say, an apprentice would sign on with a journeyman to learn to how to do carpentry. Well, Jesus was in that same position. Most Jewish boys followed their father's career. They didn't have many options, so they did what their father had taught them to do, starting at a very young age. And Jesus then would have been a carpenter until he reached age 30 and went into his own ministry. So he was an apprentice to Joseph. this term back then was used in academic, trade, and religious contexts. Philosophers of the day would have disciples. For instance, Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, would take a few chosen people who showed promise, and they would become his disciples. They would follow him around for years and years till they could master, in this case, philosophy. The rabbi, Jesus was a rabbi, was he not? Amen. Right. As a rabbi, he was a teacher of the law, and he chose only a few of who he called to be his disciples, unlike the other rabbis who only wanted to take the smartest and the brightest and the most connected. Jesus called simple men to be his disciples. We don't know exactly why, but possibly because they were more trainable. You know, when you get smart, you start to push away and think that you don't need any advice or teaching. So these men were simple men, and they were willing to learn from Jesus. And that discipleship could last years or decades. And in the disciples' case, they were disciples for 3 years, of course, before Christ went on, and he assigned them to take up the work he had taught them. He chose 12 elite disciples, which he would also call apostles. Now, there were other disciples, but there were only 12 apostles among those disciples. So secondly, what did Jesus expect or require of his disciples? We said that Jesus was very demanding, was he not? In one place he would say, take my yoke and learn from me, I'm meek and lowly. And we'll read that verse in a second. But what he really says about discipleship, his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me, found in Matthew 16:24. So Jesus is telling them, if you want to be my disciple, I require everything of you. I require a total commitment to learning from me. Number one, he expected his disciples to observe and learn from him. That was their main job as a disciple. In Matthew 11:28-30, Jesus said to them, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." If you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the yoke Jesus was talking about. As a rabbi, you would have what was called a yoke, and that was your version of the law and the traditions and the customs. And if you had a disciple, you placed that yoke on them. And it was the same way for his disciples. Secondly, he expected us to serve, to worship him first, and to serve others. In John chapter 13, right before the Lord's Supper, John tells us the Lord's Supper in a completely different manner. And remember, John's main interest in his gospel is to teach the theology of Christ as being foremost sovereign deity. So in John 13. In verses 4 and 5, it says, he got up from the meal. He took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And then skipping to verse 12 through 17, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and he returned to his place at the table. He asked them, do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher, and you call me Lord, and rightly so, because that's what I am. But now that I your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, also should you wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. And third, his third requirement was that they model themselves after him. And that is what we're expected to do today, right? To model him. That's why the Gospels are so important. Because it contains the teaching and the law and requirements of Jesus Christ. There were some in the American Restoration Movement early in the 1800s and in the 1900s that didn't believe in some of the Gospels. They didn't have them in their Bible. They thought that Paul's teaching were sufficient, and that the Gospels, for instance, in John and other places where he did miracles, they had questions about that, and so they didn't even include those Gospels in their Bible. So we need to model ourselves after him. In Matthew 10, 24 and 25, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher, and the servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they malign those of his household? So we're to model ourselves after him. Next week, we'll talk about what that looks like in the 21st century. How do we model ourselves in these times, in this culture, in this country? And then his fourth requirement was to witness for him. To witness for him. We all know the Great Commission in Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. After Jesus had risen, he was about to ascend back to heaven. He said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. So he expects us to witness for him, to share the gospel. How are we doing on that? Just a question. Some of these requirements I cringe at myself when I think, am I doing that or not? You know, it's easy for me to find fault with others, but I'm just as guilty of being lacking in that as well. And then he finishes up in verse 20. He says, teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. model him, and then witness for him, teaching his commandments. So we'll ask the question, each of us ask the question of ourselves, how am I matching up with Jesus' expectations, the requirements he gives me in the New Testament? In relation to observing and learning from him, are we in our word often? Serving and worshiping him? We worship corporately, but are we doing it individually on our own? Are we worshiping God? Are we in his word? Do we sing to ourselves? Do we pray? And other acts of worship? And do we serve others as well? And then finally, are we modeling ourselves after him? Are we modeling ourselves after him? Back, I guess it was in the 90s, if you may remember, the popular "What Would Jesus Do" came out, and you'd see it on posters, on bracelets, on necklaces. You saw it everywhere. And it grew to be a cliche, but it isn't a cliche. In the heart of a true disciple, we should always ask ourselves in situations, what would Jesus do? And then do what you think he would have done. So, next week we'll talk about 21st century discipleship. And then the following week we'll talk about spiritual formation. Spiritual formation. But at this time, we want to offer an invitation to anyone who would like to obey the gospel, or if you have need of prayer or whatever, you're invited to come while we stand and sing.